Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us here tonight. I'm Jim Ogle, the Executive Director for Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Welcome to tonight's continuing programs on the sites here in Freedom's Frontier, representing the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Tonight, we'll tell you the story of the Western Route, how freedom seekers took the road less traveled to find freedom. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items for you as attendees. There are two ways to ask questions. The first is to click on the question and answer button at the bottom of your computer screen. You can type in a question there and I'll be happy to ask it for you. You can also ask your question on your own. To do so, just click the raise your hand function on your computer. I'll call on you and open both your audio and video if you want to turn on your camera. So as the mood strikes you, please ask questions during our program tonight. Now, I'd like to take just a moment to share with you a few pieces of information about Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. We're very excited that we're a part of this celebration of the Underground Railroad at this time, and particularly the sites on the network to freedom. One of the reasons that's so important to us is our mission is to tell the stories of the struggles for freedom in our region and their lasting impact on our nation. Now, we have three nationally significant stories we tell at Freedom's Frontier: the Missouri-Kansas Border War and the Civil War, the settling of the frontier, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Now, Freedom's Frontier encompasses the counties you see outlined on this map. We have 29 in Kansas, 12 in Missouri. It constitutes an area the size of South Carolina, and we have about 3 million people who live in that area. Now, our map has been our primary tool to share with you these extraordinary stories and these extraordinary sites. But as part of our efforts for the Underground Railroad Month, we went a step further. We created a special app to help you discover the stories. Let me show you a little bit about that app.
Sometimes the most important stories aren't widely told. Sometimes what matters the most remains a secret, even if it's right in front of us. There's a place that defined the history of our nation, where patriots fighting for freedom gained victories that lasted through the years to secure equal freedoms for all Americans. We're talking about the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. If you didn't know you had such a place around you, the FFNHA app is for you. You'll discover important historic sites and museums, all connected to tell the remarkable stories that shaped our nation. The settlement of the frontier, the border war and civil war, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Thanks to our easy-to-use app, you'll find tours and amazing places to visit that bring the region together and make it come alive. Visit the App Store or the Google Play Store. Download the FFNHA app and discover the stories that changed a nation. Enjoy the ride. History awaits.
We hope that you will connect to the Freedom's Frontier app. As I mentioned, we have this special history tour for you as part of what we're doing with the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It tells you the story of the Network to Freedom, but also outlines the specific sites along the way and gives you directions to each of those sites. As you can see this article about the Mount Mitchell Heritage Prairie. Now, one of the special attributes of this app is that just as you can, when we were pre-COVID, get National Park Service passport stamps physically, we can do them digitally with the app. All you need to do is download the app, visit a site on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, and you'll automatically receive the digital passport stamp in your app. Now, we hope many of you will take the opportunity to collect all of these stamps along the way. Now, the app is available both for people who have Apple products and for those who use Android products. You can find it in the Google Play Store. I'm excited that you've joined us for this National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom event. And I'm thrilled to introduce to you our presenter for this evening. As the president of the Mount Mitchell Prairie Guards, Michael Stubbs led the effort that created the Mount Mitchell Heritage Prairie, a historic property formerly owned by the Kansas State Historical Society. The 170-acre tallgrass prairie is dedicated to Captain William Mitchell and the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony. An important feature of the park is the existence of swales from a portion of the Topeka-Fort Riley Road. The trail was used by Charles Fremont's Oregon expedition in 1842. Between 1857 and 1861, it served as the westernmost route of the Underground Railroad in Kansas Territory. The park is a Network to Freedom commemorative site and a Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area star attraction. I'm pleased to welcome joining us now Michael Stubbs, who also has one other designation. He's been a most valuable partner of Freedom's Frontier. Michael, good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Unmuted. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted, Michael, and now you just need to turn that camera back on and you're good to go. There we have you.
You have me. Okay. I'm sorry. The entire feed cut out a few seconds ago, so I just barely got back on. And am I supposed to be seeing myself? Well, anyway, here we go. I'm assuming you all can see me. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Jim said, my program is on the westernmost route of the Underground Railroad in the Kansas counties of Douglas, Shawnee, Wabaunsee, Pottawatomie, Riley, and Nemaha. It's also known as the westernmost route of the Lane Trail. In June of 1860, the westernmost route of the Underground Railroad in Kansas Territory was running from the claim of Reverend John Stewart, south of Lawrence on the Wakarusa, then west up the river valley to safe houses in Bloomington and Auburn, then on to the Harvey Settlement on Dragoon Creek, present-day Harveyville. From the Harvey Settlement, those seeking their freedom were taken either northwest to the Mission Creek community of Free Staters from Wisconsin, or directly to the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony's location at Wabaunsee on Antelope Creek, near the Kansas River. According to Charles Leonhardt, an active conductor and author of an 1870 manuscript titled The Last Train, this route was used in cases of extreme caution, and to this out-of-the-way place only express trains ran when danger demanded it. In his account of the train that left Camp Stewart on June 13, 1860, he describes two passengers that fit this description. We also had the manservant Joe and woman cook Nancy, who were claimed as chattels by a major at Fort Leavenworth, with whose united market price had been $2,800 in gold. With these two slaves had also come an almost white girl of about 17 years, Kate, who had been sold at a most fabulous price. This particular train had 19 passengers in 4 wagons with 10 drivers and guards. It took them 21 days to reach Nebraska. It's not known how many passengers were transported on this out-of-the-way spur of the lane trail, but it was in operation between 1857 and 1860. After researching all known accounts, an estimate of less than 100 people is probably accurate. The Underground Railroad in Kansas Territory was unique in comparison with previous efforts in the states to assist enslaved people seeking their freedom. First, almost all of the Kansas Underground Railroad participants knew each other from the many free state political meetings and constitutional conventions they attended. Second, it was not uncommon for passengers to stay at a particular depot for weeks or even months at a time before moving on. Following are accounts of the Underground Railroad associated with the settlements I've mentioned. First was Auburn in Shawnee County. Prior to setting up post offices, this community was initially called Brownsville, and it was determined that it had actually ended up being on the Osage Reservation, and so it had to be moved. And then later, when the town developed, it was called Auburn. Charles Leonhardt says, the next day we started for Auburn Station. Dr. Sabin, now of Louisville, Pottawatomie County, kept the depot there. At his cabin on a branch of the Wakarusa, we found a colored passenger whom I begged to leave to introduce as my George. My George had his free papers with him. He was a free colored man, but his last owner had a chattel mortgage given to the grantor, which remained unpaid. The wife and 2 children of this man had belonged to a certain Ben Johnson in Leavenworth County and were already on the train, having been shipped to us by the Leavenworth and Lawrence Night Express. Then we move on to Harveyville. Early Harveyville settler Stephen Jackson Spear tells us there was no published time card for that first railroad that ran through our settlement, and no regularity was observed in the running of the trains. The road was in operation during the years 1857, 1858, and 1859, and all the cars ran at night. The stations were few and far apart, the one on Dragoon Creek being in the loft of Henry Harvey's house. Enoch Platt's house in Wabaunsee was the next station. The railroad was better known as the Underground Railroad, and runaway slaves were the only passengers carried. Now, here's a map. This is my favorite. Oops. Well, okay. We'll go to this one first. Okay, we're back to this one. This is the Whitman and Searle map of 1856. It was the very first map made by local people with local knowledge. Whitman and Searle both lived and worked in Lawrence. And this, I just love this map. So you'll see where on the lower right, where the red line starts, that's Reverend Stewart's place. And it goes up, you'll see Brownville there, where it's before it curves to go to the north. That lowest point is Harveyville. And then it goes up to where it says Massasoit on the map. And that's Mission Creek. And it was later the community of Keene, which was founded, among others, by the Ross brothers from Appleton, Wisconsin. They were newspapermen, and the 2 brothers started a newspaper in Lawrence, and then it moved to Topeka, or the other way around, I forget. And Edmund G. Ross is famous for being made senator after the suicide of Jim Lane. And he's also in John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, because it was his vote that saved Andrew Johnson from being impeached. And anyway, so that settlement at Mission Creek was a very strong community of Free State people from Wisconsin. And later, Rossville was founded by one of these brothers. Okay, I digress. So from Massasoit, or Mission Creek as it was called, it went up across the divide to Wabaunsee. That's, as far as we can tell, they made about 20 miles a day, a wagon journey. 30 was max. That's just how long it took in that form of transportation. And so then from Wabaunsee, this is the most enigmatic part of the story. We don't know specifically where they went from Wabaunsee, but they ended up in southeast Nebraska. And it seems to me that that's too far for a day's journey. So this is one of the mysteries that, but I'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to read you, there was a local newspaper man, he was sheriff, quite interesting man named Frank Hodgson. And his father was Jehu Hodgson and his mother was Mary Hodgson. And they also were Quakers in the Harvey Settlement. The Harvey Settlement was originally founded, Henry Harvey had been, I'm sorry, I'm giving Jim a hard time with the images. Sorry, Jim. The Harvey Settlement was founded by Quakers who had been in Kansas, the Harvey and his wife, Henry Harvey and his wife Anne, since the 1830s. They had been at the Quaker mission in around Kansas City. And so they knew that they accompanied the guy who did the first survey of the area. So they knew the territory well, and they decided to settle down at what became known as Harveyville, which was right near the Santa Fe Trail and also on the road from Leavenworth to Council Grove. And so Hodgson's, they were also part of this settlement. The extended Harvey family there must have been over 30 people at least. Anyway, so I'm going to read you, this was written by Frank about his parents. He was only a very small child, so his telling this story is handed down in the family. It's not firsthand experience. So it's called Pioneer Days in Wabaunsee County. Charlie the Slave. The first we heard of Charlie, he was a runaway slave working in the timber of Joel Hayworth, owner of a sawmill located about 9 miles southwest of Emporia on the Cottonwood River, also a Quaker. As it was midsummer and the trees in full leaf and timber plants were well grown, Charlie could work in the timber without great danger of detection. Few knew of his whereabouts, but as his master offered a reward of $1,500 for his return, his being at Hayworth had leaked out. One day, some men from below Emporia rode up on Charlie to take him back to his master and bondage. Whether Charlie had plans made or whether his head worked fast, I cannot say, but he told them, all right, he guessed they'd had him, but he said he had to get some clothing back at the cabin and he'd like to go get it. They had no objections to that, and Charlie walked ahead across the river and on to the cabin. When the cabin was reached, Charlie sauntered in while they dismounted. He knew the cabin and that it had a rear as well as a front door. While he entered the front door leisurely enough, he hit the rear door on high, and about 2 jumps put him into a tall Cottonwood Valley cornfield. So far as his captors were concerned, Charlie was gone, and the reward evaporated right there. So did Charlie's chance of staying there at the same time. It was decided to take him to the Harvey Settlement on the Dragoon, and a man named Hunt and Charlie started on horseback to make the trip. The foregoing account was told many times when I was a boy by my stepfather, who lived near and knew the circumstances. But more of Charlie's history became familiar to me through a different source. How he got into the settlement, I never heard, but in due time, he showed up at Henry Harvey's, who lived on what is now the Horace Thompson place, just north of town. Also a Network to Freedom site, the site of the Harvey cabin. Harvey's home was the station for the Underground Railroad for this settlement. Al Harvey, Henry's son, was under suspicion at the time and being shadowed. He asked my parents to care for Charlie. We had plenty of hazel brush and timber, and he hid out without difficulty. But autumn was here and hiding out was uncomfortable. One stormy night, Charlie came in and hung out under the bed. When breakfast was ready the next morning, Mother stepped to the side of the bed and announced, "Breakfast is ready, Law 2. When his head appeared from under the bed, my brother, a boy of 7 years, felt the end of time must be near, for it was his bed. Before breakfast was over, someone rapped at the door and Charlie dove under the bed. The caller was a stayer and did not go until early noon. Nothing occurred to lead to his discovery, but I imagine there might be a tense situation. During the summer, a woman and 5 children had been spirited out of Lawrence and brought here until the search for her had died out. She was kept on Mission Creek, what I referred to before as the settlement from Appleton, Wisconsin. And as cold weather approached, arrangements were made to move them farther north. Moving a woman and 5 children was more of a problem, and it was left to my father to solve, Jehu Hudson. This is their cabin. And incidentally, there's a wonderful article. This was the first cabin made in 1857, I think, from instead of logs, it was from milled lumber. So where was I? For my father to solve. This he did by putting a false bottom in his wagon box and placing a few inches of corn on top. He packed the entire bunch, Charlie, the woman, and 5 children beneath the corn and started his trip to Leavenworth. And now this is a digression, as you will see. What? They're going from Harveyville to Leavenworth? What about the westernmost route? Interesting. I don't know what to say. I haven't figured that out yet. When he came to the Kaw River at Topeka, he unloaded west of town about where the state hospital is now located. And you know, this was written in the 1930s. So this is where the sports center is there for people who know Topeka on West 6th. The fugitives were rowed across the river during the night, and Father crossed on the ferry about where the Mellon Bridge is located. Next morning, he reloaded and went on his way.
Well, we've appeared to have lost Michael and his connection as he was trying to share with us about this continuing story along the way. Michael had left me some notes that said, what became of Charlie and the woman and her brood I never knew. They just disappeared into the beckoning north and freedom. As the woman and children had a reward of $2,000 hanging over their hats, and Charlie a reward of $1,500 over him, that was likely the highest price lack of livestock ever hauled from Dragoon Creek. The next portion, talking about Mission Creek and the like, the settlements of Fremont in Wabaunsee County. In the late 19th century, Ohio State University professor Wilbur H. Siebert embarked on a project to collect remembrances of Underground Railroad activity from a decreasing pool of living participants and their descendants. He sent questionnaires to postmasters all over the country, asking them to document Underground Railroad routes, participants, and incidents. He asked about the route through the area, the years of activity, and the system of communication between conductors, memorable incidents, the informant's personal connection with the Underground Railroad, names and addresses of any potential additional informants, and a biographical sketch of the correspondent or the chief Underground Railroad participant in the area. Siebert's research culminated in the Underground Railroad, From Slavery to Freedom, published in 1898. Siebert's research methods have come under criticism in recent years, but the information he gathered about Kansas Underground Railroad activities is invaluable. O.W. Little, who was the editor of the Alma Enterprise, wrote to Siebert in 1936 about the Mission Creek community. His information corroborates brief mentions of the Mission Creek stations from earlier sources. Dear Mr. Siebert, I presume this letter is too late to do you any good. I was born in this county after the Civil War in 1867, but I never heard my folks or any of the neighbors talk about the Underground Railroad, and have found very few of the second generation who knew or had heard their folks talk about it. Some of the slaves who crossed this county seem to have come in from Auburn in Shawnee County, and some of them came with George Ross's place. Michael, if you'd like to pick up, I'm telling them about, I'm reading to them the letter written to Mr. Siebert and talking about how some of the slaves who crossed in the county had seemed to come in from Auburn in Shawnee County.
Okay, so I don't know, I kept talking, so it was quite interesting. Okay, so here we go again. Some of the slaves who crossed this county seem to have come in from Auburn and Shawnee County. Some of them came to the George Ross place near Dover. Some came to the Harvey Loomis place a few miles further west, and some to the Dr. Beach place near what was later the Keene Post Office. Wasn't he a handsome dude? Ross, that is. Anyway, so who is this writing? Little. This is Little, who was the local newspaper editor. He's writing, I find no further trace of them until they reached the Captain William Mitchell place in the north part of the county, near Wabaunsee. There was another station or two near what is now Zeendale, a few miles north, actually it's west, of Wabaunsee. One woman, Mrs. Eddie Beach Snyder, now living in Topeka, and remember this is writing in the 1930s, and who was born during the war, tells me she remembers her mother telling of two valuable slaves who were brought to their home from Auburn, one being kept at their place all winter, the other at the Loomis place. A letter was received from them after they got to Canada. Boy, would I like to find that letter. What little I can get is very fragmentary, and not one of the settlers who were here at that time is yet alive. If this is any good to you, I shall be glad. Very truly yours, O.W. Little. So this photograph, right if you follow the line between the wheat and the whatever that other crop is, later wheat, I guess, straight up, you're on K4, you're looking south, and where the slaves were hidden freedom seekers during that period that they stayed at the beaches was in those trees up on that ridge. And the great-great-grandson of Captain Beach actually showed me exactly where his grandfather had shown him where they stayed. And it was just a crude shelter in the woods, as had also been mentioned with Charlie the Slave at Harveyville. Okay, so now we move on to Wabaunsee. This is that road, the Topeka-Fort Riley Road, as it exists. I took this picture a few years ago, but the ruts from the trail are visible all the way from Topeka here now and then, all the way to Manhattan, if you know where to look. and the fields haven't been plowed. Anyway, so what you're seeing there in the distance is Mount Mitchell, and you can see the little dot, that's the monument to the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony. So anyway, back to the narrative here. So Wabaunsee was called Antelope Creek, the Hartford Settlement, it had the Connecticut Settlement, different names, but mostly nowadays we call it the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony or Company, the settlers who settled there and joined the previous settlers, Free State settlers who had been there a year or two before. So documentation of Underground Railroad activity in the Wabaunsee community is the most extensive of all the stations on the westernmost route through Kansas Territory. Through accounts of old settlers' meetings, letters, and personal reminiscences, we know the names of most of those involved. Captain Mitchell's son, Will, responded to Siebert's query in 1935. He tells Siebert a story told to him by his Aunt Agnes, who kept house for her father and brother until 1868, when she went back to Connecticut. In 1882, Agnes returned to live with the Mitchells for her final years. She died in 1891 and is buried in the Wabaunsee Cemetery. She told of their having 8 runaway slaves concealed in the attic of their cabin, awaiting favorable weather conditions for their movement north. My father and his associate left with an ox team with the Negroes concealed in the wagon bed and covered with straw. They reached the ford of the Kansas River about 3 miles distant at the first streak of dawn, only to find that there was a thick crust of ice along the shores of the river, where the water was stagnant, while the middle of the stream, where there was a strong current, was open water. In order to ford the river, it was necessary to cut out a large cake of ice, which the Negroes did, and 2 or 3 of them poled themselves across the open water on this cake of ice. To the opposite side, and there cut out a similar runway in the ice to enable the oxen to get out of the river with the wagon. When all was ready, the balance of the party drove the oxen into the opening, forded the river, and emerged on the other side. The day proved to be a mild one in the early winter, and they made good headway over the prairies to the north. But just before night, a sudden blizzard, typical of that country and season, broke, and in a short time, a blinding snowstorm developed and the temperature dropped very rapidly. Darkness fell and the trail was soon obliterated. But they could do nothing but keep on, as there was no shelter of any kind. Along toward midnight, they finally came to a small wooded stream, and as they were completely lost, they made camp there as the timber offered both shelter and the possibility of fire, which was soon started. In this way, they managed to keep from freezing until daylight. At dawn, the storm subsided as suddenly as it had come on, and there was a small hill not far distant. One of the party climbed it to try and get their bearings. To his great surprise, the small hamlet that they were headed for lay only a short distance away. My impression is the name of this village was Centralia, Nemaha County, but I cannot be positive at this late date, nor do I know the route by which these runaway slaves reached my father's cabin. Presumably, they came by way of Lawrence or possibly some settlement on Mission Creek. His associate in the venture just related was Enoch Platt, son of Jera Platt, famous Underground Railroad station master at Mendon, Illinois, who was a considerably younger man than my father. Mitchell was 49 in 1856. Enoch Platt was 31. And I think was much more active on the Underground Railroad than my father, for I have often heard it related that the Missourians at the time had set a price of $1,000 on his head. So I'm gonna read now from Charles Leonhardt's list of the Underground Railroad stations that's in the collection of the Kansas State Historical Society. Hartford Settlement Station. Among the active workers were Captain William Mitchell, Enoch Platt, and their near neighbors on the Antelope Creek. In the town of Wabaunsee were Samuel R. Weed and the house of C.B. Lines, the most conspicuous conductors. Charles Lines was the leader of the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony that came from They left from New Haven, Connecticut to come to Wabaunsee. West of this station were many dangerous places to pass before reaching the stations on the Blue and the Kaw. Along the Kaw bottom and north of Deep Creek, the early settlers were most all from southern states and very pro-slavery, with the honorable exception of the Allen families from Ohio, Quaker abolitionist stock. Lewis Haynes and Robert Earl, the rest were not friendly, and including Lewis Haynes and Robert Earl, the rest were not friendly to our cause. St. George, north of Kaw, had become the home of one Gillespie and others from Kentucky, and was also a place to be avoided. So this is from Cutler's History of the State of Kansas, published in 1883 by A.T. Andreas of Chicago. Enoch Platt, farmer, P.O. Wabaunsee, was born in Plymouth, Connecticut in 1825, and with his parents removed to Adams County, Illinois in 1834, where he remained until 1858, when he located on Section 5, 90 acres of which are under cultivation, Section 5 in Wabaunsee Township. During his early life, Mr. Platt was one of the most successful conductors on the Underground Railroad. He and his father being strong Free State men, there being at one time $1,000 offered for his head. He suffered extensively in loss of horses, etc. at various times. So then I'm going to read you excerpts from one of my previous researchers in Wabaunsee County, Roberta Smith Cagle. And her papers are at the Wabaunsee County Historical Society in Alma. She was a great-granddaughter of the conductor Joshua Smith and the granddaughter of John Smith, who Joshua was actually the station master and John was the conductor. When I was a very small girl, I remember hearing the family tell of the runaway Negroes that they used to hide in a hazel and plum thicket tangled with wild grapevines, a little way north of grandfather's barn, over on the east side. And I especially remember a Negro and her 6 children that they cared for several days until it was safe to take her on her way. They told of taking out the breakfast and day supplies one morning and finding her scared nearly to death. I did not know that there were small stations of a great system known as the Underground Railroad. At one time, Colonel Lyons had a colored boy with him all winter. This was not uncommon. Due to the extreme dangers of the Underground Railroad, the conductors would run loads only when full, not just for 1 or 2 slaves. So some had to be farmed out until enough were gathered to run a train or a load. Emma and Monica, daughters of Joshua Smith, wrote about their father's involvement in the Underground Railroad. They never saw a slave at their house. They were unaware of his involvement as children. Slaves snuck in at night or kept in caves, they thought. Actually, it was out in the plum thickets. The girls could not understand why mother cooked so much food, yet they had so little on their own table. So here's, now I get into Charles Leonhardt's accounts. I spoke about him at the beginning. He wrote, I'm not sure, do I talk about it here? Well, I'll finish this and then tell you about the last train. I know Todd is listening, or he was. New Boston, Manhattan in Riley County. And this is again from Charles Leonhardt's list. At the mouth of the Big Blue River and the Kaw was New Boston, afterwards Manhattan. Both places were only flag stations. They had no established depots. And he uses the term flag station as a reference to people who would help the cause by relaying information through the use of flags. Sometimes these people were called upon to offer shelter as well, but we have very little knowledge or record of the men in this story that at Juniata and in Manhattan. All I really know is that they were flag stations. They weren't actually stations where people stayed regularly. Anyway, sometimes these people were called upon to offer shelter as well. Among the most conspicuous, hardworking train dispatchers and other prominent officials was the Reverend Washington Marlett, whose little stone dwelling on the claim he still lives on in 1870 was perhaps the temporary stopping place from which many a fugitive stepped forth on his far journey northward. Isaiah Goodnow and Reverend Joseph Dennison, living then in their humble cabin, and other Eastern immigrants aided in the cause. But their work, kind reader, was religiously based upon the doctrine, what thy right hand doeth, the left hand knoweth not, or knows not, not knows. Not so with Sam Houston. He, if called upon to come forth and leave his little flock in that rude log cabin on the Wildcat Creek, would cheerfully bounce out and give a leading hand most willingly. He is the only one of us many railroad hands that did succeed to be promoted afterwards into paying federal officers. Grand stone dwellings and extensive stone stables have utterly annihilated even recollections of that primitive abode on his former pioneer home. And it's interesting, in Manhattan, there are streets named for all of these people. This grand stone dwelling is now, I think, registered on the National Historic Register. So up the river at the Big Blue, where Rocky Mill Ford now stands, it's long gone, we had a water tank and kept that place to mislead possible pursuit. This is the town of Juniata. And please, everybody, it's Juniata. It's not Juanita. It's named after, Dyer was from Pennsylvania. He ran a store there. He was alleged to be pro-slavery, but there's also hints that he helped the Underground Railroad cause. Anyway, Juniata is named after a river in Pennsylvania where he was from. So over at the north of the Blue River, again, among those grand and silent hills along the deep ravines with hardly any settlers on Cedar or the other creeks, it would have been impossible to follow us over north towards Centralia and Seneca. So I didn't really get into talking more about Leonhardt's. Now, is the spelling reversed? Am I supposed to push a button and make it?
Yeah, it's fine for those of us. I read Wagon Train to Freedom by Todd Mildfeld.
Okay, great. I had to plug you, Todd. This is what we have at the moment. It's a children's book, but it's wonderfully written and illustrated. And it tells the story of that train trip with those, what did I say, 19 passengers and 10 helpers, wagon drivers and whatnot. It tells that story from June of 1861. And someday Judy Sweets is working on a book, more of an academic book, with the original records at the State Historical Society. And she's footnoting and getting into, well, who were these freedom seekers? What happened to them? And we know that Kate, some of these people ended up in Iowa and staying and settling in Iowa and then coming back to this area. And Kate, the one that Leonhardt talks about, she did come back, and her descendants live in Kansas City today. And I'm excited to see Judy's book when it's finally ready, to tell those stories about what happened to those freedom seekers and also the people involved. So that's generally the story of the Underground Railroad through Wabaunsee County from Lawrence. And I'd just like to say one thing about the Lane Trail. I get a little annoyed. William Connolly, who was head of the Kansas State Historical Society back in the day, I guess in the 1890s, maybe, he wrote a map, or made a map of the Lane Trail in Kansas and the Lane Trail in Iowa. And we get so stuck on this map that he made, we think it's a modern highway map. The fact is, the Underground Railroad through Kansas was a series of safe houses. And there was, as you saw in Harveyville, there was the Harvey cabin. Well, there was also the Hodgson cabin. They couldn't go to the Harvey cabin because Al was being watched. Well, so they went to the Hodgkin cabin. Well, it's that way all through. The Lane Trail wasn't A, B, C, D. It was going through neighborhoods where there were helpful people. And maybe Centralia and Seneca, maybe that is the exception that proves the rule. Maybe there was only those two places out there. But so I just want you to think about it. When you see that map that looks so precise, oh, they went from here to there, that it was more fluid than that.
Michael, I greatly appreciate you making that point, because it's we're often driven by an illustration and the like, and thinking that was the only way along the way. I want to invite those who are attending to use the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you'd like of Michael. I'm particularly glad you were able to log back in, Michael, since I would not be able to do justice to question and answer right now. But I thought it would be interesting for people to understand why you have developed such a passion for telling these stories over the years.
Well, you know, I've been asked that before. In the 8th grade, I got so interested in history. I had a wonderful, Ron Olson, I still remember his name, at Jardine Junior High School in Topeka, Kansas. Ron Olson just instilled in me a love of history. And, you know, President Kennedy was I can't believe I'm a little bit choked up. President Kennedy was assassinated when I was in his class. And I think that also helped, you know, being in a history class at such a historic moment was very powerful. And I did my term paper on Harriet Tubman. And I don't know why I chose Harriet Tubman, but I did. What are you in the 8th grade, 14 or something? And so then later, you know, I think I must have told my grandfather about it. Well, lo and behold, my family were involved in the Underground Railroad in Ohio. And my great aunt, my grandfather's youngest sister, she lived with her grandfather. She lived out on the farm, and she stayed with him during the week and take care of him and go to school. This is in central Kansas. And he told her about waking up in the morning with a little black boy in bed with him, because his father ran a station on the Underground Railroad. And I don't know, somehow that all came together. Here I am years and years later, and we had the opportunity with the Territorial Kansas Heritage Alliance to get into documenting the Underground Railroad in Kansas. And so I guess with that background, I just jumped at the chance 20 years ago when some of the people on this podcast at the moment, we all participated in discovering these stories. And so what I've told you today is 20 years of, you know, figuring it all out.
Michael, I really appreciate you sharing that. I know it's wonderful to have teachers who inspire us and tell us, develop a fire in us for one thing or another. I have a question from Chris, who asks, were free state settlements established along the Topeka-Fort Riley Road in the 1850s to 60s?
Good question, Chris. Well, it ran from Topeka. It went to Uniontown. So that was the first stop from Uniontown. And you know, Uniontown ceased to be in the 1850s because of a cholera epidemic. Then there was Bursaw's Mill, which See, here's the thing, Chris. It just clicked with me. We're in the Potawatomi Indian Reservation. The settlement at Wabaunsee was the first farmable land west of the reservation. You see there, you can kind of see the dotted line. That's the Potawatomi Reservation. So to answer your question, no, not, because the reservation wasn't extinguished until the 1870s. So not really, but Bursaw's Mills was, Barassa was the French Canadian Indian name. That was, there are, everybody who traveled through that road who kept a diary talked about Bursaw's Mills. And we have one of those descendants with us in our history community in Topeka. John Bursaw is a direct descendant of Jude Barassa. I hope it have. If there was Napoleon and Jude, and I always get them confused. Anyway, so not really, Chris.
Well, thank you, Michael. And tell our viewers tonight a little bit more about the Mount Mitchell Heritage Prairie and the extraordinary story of the Mitchell family along the way, and what your Prairie Guards are doing relative to that. And let me see if I can share some appropriate slides for you.
Okay, well, this is Captain Mitchell in his later years, and on his right was his sister Agnes, who cooked and, you know, washed the clothes of the freedom seekers. And the next slide you showed was the park. We've in 2017, we were presented with a dilemma. The property right next to where the camera is, I'm standing on the property that we just purchased. It's zoned commercial residential, and we felt that we had no option but to purchase this land and incorporate it into the park. So that's what we did, and it's all part of Captain Mitchell's farm. And if you see, not the tree, but if you follow to the left, there's a little white dot on the top of the hill there. Well, Captain Mitchell's son, William Izot Mitchell, gave 30 acres of his father's farm, the hilltop, which was just the hilltop. And you can see over on the right, there's a little line. Well, that's where the 30 acres used to end. And we've added 125 acres to the park, 25 more of prairie, and 100 acres of restored prairie we're restoring, reseeding and everything. Well, anyway, so the little white dot is a monument to Captain Mitchell and the Beecher Bible Rifle Colony. They came out from New Haven, Connecticut in April of 1856, and their journey out to Kansas was covered in all the major newspapers at the time. It was kind of like the O.J. Simpson trial, because what had led up to their departure was Henry Ward Beecher was proclaiming from the pulpit of a church in New Haven that a Sharp's rifle was more important than the Bible in the struggle in Kansas to make it free. And so a lot of Southern people sent their children to Yale in New Haven to go to school. And so a lot of people got riled up about that. And there were editorials, and that's how actually the newspaper articles, when the colony got ready to come to Kansas, Beecher, the guy who was going to supply them with arms, reneged. And so at this rally, Beecher said, well, we can't let them go unarmed. If you all can raise 25 money to buy 25 rifles, I'll get 25 money for 25 from my congregants in Brooklyn, New York. And so they had this, oh, Mr. Killam, he'll give $25 for a rifle. That's an appropriate name. And anyway, this banter, which is totally recorded, you know, almost word for word. So then the newspapers printed, Bibles and rifles for Kansas. And so then the Beecher Bible, the Sharp's rifle took on the nickname Beecher's Bible. And anyway, so they came out, and Charles Lyons, who was one of the conductors in Wabaunsee, he wrote letters that were published in all the newspapers about their progress. And it put these people in the colony and the whole Kansas story front and foremost. And so to honor his father in the colony, Will Mitchell donated this 30-acre property and to the Kansas State Historical Society, and stipulated it would be a public park to, honor that story. And so for various reasons, the Historical Society was not able to fulfill the wish other than erecting the monument on top of the hill. And so in 2003, we started negotiated with them, this ad hoc group of people that now is the Mount Mitchell Prairie Guards. We started negotiating with them about transferring it to local control. And that happened in 2006. Everything in the park, this multi-historic place, recreational place. There's a Native American burial mound on top of the hill that makes the site sacred for everybody. And we always acknowledge and respect that, the First Peoples. And we have walking trails. We have the ruts and swales of the Topeka-Fort Riley Road. You can actually walk in the ruts. Our trail is mowed in such a way. This year, the prairie grass in that part of the park is 7 feet tall. It's one of the few places you can actually see tallgrass prairie be tall. But most of all, education is our goal. We want the park to be, it already had, for 20 years has been used by homeschoolers. Richard Pitts, who passed away recently, he used it even before we were involved to teach about the Underground Railroad. So our website, mountmitchellprairie.org, we're trying to build it so that we tell all these stories. And Kristen, if you're still here, I need help with the Native American page. So far, I've just put the websites of all the local tribes so that I can direct people there. But ultimately, we're envisioning a visitor center where all the stories can be told, the Native American, the military, the expansion of the country and the military road that went through, the Underground Railroad road that went through, same road. And it's a place, most of all, to learn about the tallgrass prairie and the preservation of the tallgrass prairie. As I said, we have 100 acres that we're restoring back to native. And ironically, its grass is 8 feet tall this year. Don't ask me to explain that. Kelly Kincher is coming next week to explain that. Anyway, I'm rambling. Jim, put me back on course.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Joe Potter from Shawnee is asking, you mentioned the conductor Plath who had a $1,000 price on his head. Were other conductors in danger from slave bounty hunters or pro-slavery settlers?
Yes, I don't think they necessarily had bounties on their head. I mean, Enoch Platt was so well known because of his father's activities in Mendon, Illinois. And I don't know of anybody else having a bounty on their head, but I think one of my slides might have been about slave catchers are in the area in Lawrence. And that was definitely something all the families had to worry about. But fortunately, this trail came over. Here we go. See the wagon coming over the trail there. This is a painting by Callie Krallman. Thank you very much for doing this for us. This is the reason there's so much sky is on our National Park Service style sign, which is right there on the trail now. All the text is up in the sky. Anyway, so see this wagon coming. Well, the settlers were all down there in the valley, so they could see somebody coming and have, 20, 30 minutes warning. And there are incidences of slave catchers being seen and the community being warned. But to answer your question, I only know of 2 instances where they mentioned that there were slave hunters in the area, but nobody was ever caught. But as you may know, the fine was imprisonment and $1,000 if you were caught assisting freedom seekers.
That's a lot of money for any of us today. It was an extraordinary amount of money back then, was it not?
I looked it up once. It's something like $25,000 or something. Yeah, it's not our $1,000.
Very much so. And also, I've got a question from Don Lambert, who'd like you to talk a little bit more about the Canadian French settlement you're mentioning.
Oh, well, they weren't French Canadians. They were Potawatomi. They were Potawatomi that are now known as the Citizens Band Potawatomi. At least the Barasa brothers were. The tribe hadn't really had the schism in it that it later had when the government got involved. The Barasas were quite educated. One of them went to Hamilton University, I think is at Hamilton. It has a different name now. They were quite educated. And in fact, in the home there that served as a way station on this route, the Topeka-Fort Riley Road, they had a grand piano. And the daughters were known for their beauty and poise, and they would play the grand piano. They were quite sophisticated people, contrary to, the stereotypes that we have. So don't know that it wasn't a French Canadian settlement. It was just that the Barasa name, the Potawatomi name, came from way back when the French were involved with the Potawatomi.
Michael, I very much appreciate your patience tonight in our presentation. We survived the glitches of the internet gods and are still here standing. We want to thank all our folks who are joining us here tonight. And Michael, I want to thank you for making time not only for this program, but for one of our previous programs as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, everybody, for your patience. If you could have seen me just go on and on, you probably would have had a good laugh. I did.
Well, we never have the opportunity to know what will be thrown at us when we're trying to do a program over the internet, but we're thankful of everyone joining us here tonight. And I'm so thankful of you putting together this extensive presentation for everybody tonight. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you who are here tonight for being a part of our Underground Railroad Network to Freedom programs. We hope that you will go to the Freedom's Frontier YouTube page. We have saved all the programs there for those who would like to experience some of the stories. And again, thank you for your time this evening and your excellent questions. Take care